Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. The fog lay thick over the countryside, rolling across the fields like a living shroud as Dr. Lydia Hensley navigated the narrow, overgrown road that led to Grimsby Manor. The tires of her old station wagon crunched on the gravel, the sound muffled by the damp, suffocating silence. The manor loomed in the distance, its silhouette sharp and menacing against the darkening sky. Thunder growled somewhere far off, promising a storm. Lydia was an anthropologist whose fascination with antiques, places untouched by time, had led her to many forgotten corners of the world. But there was something different about Grimsby Manor. The villagers of Hensbrook, the nearest town, spoke of it only in whispers, their faces drawn with a mixture of fear and superstition. They called it the House of Silent Watchers, claiming that shadows moved when no one was looking, and that the air itself seemed to breathe. As she approached the manor, a chill slithered down her spine. The building stood down her spine, tall and defiant, its stone facade cracked and covered in a web of ivy that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. Shattered windows, some covered with wooden planks, stared out like the empty eyes of a corpse. The front door, an ancient Torres slab of oak reinforced with wrought iron, bore the scars of time and weather. Taking a deep breath, Lydia stepped out of the car. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the gnarled oaks that lined the property. Each creak and groan of these branches sounded like a whispered warning. She retrieved her flashlight from her bag, the beam cutting a narrow path through the mist. The silence was almost palpable, heavy with the weight of untold stories. Just another old house. She muttered to herself, but the reassurance felt hollow. She walked up the stone steps, their surface slick with moss and rain, and placed her hand on the door's iron handle. The cold metal bit into her palm as she pushed. The door creaking open with a sound that resonated through the stillness like a drawn-out sigh. The entrance hall was vast, lined with oil paintings whose subjects seemed to follow her with their eyes. Dust-covered chandeliers hung like forgotten relics, their crystals dulled and lifeless. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its wooden balustrade carved with intricate designs that time had smoothed and worn away. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic and sharp. Lydia stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She paused, straining to listen. The silence pressed down on her, dense and unnatural. Just as she was about to move deeper into the hall, a faint sound caught her attention, a soft, rhythmic thumping, as if something were knocking against the walls in the far reaches of the house. Her heart pounded as she swept her flashlight across the room. The beam revealed a portrait of a stern-faced man with eyes that seemed too lifelike, too aware. She turned away, trying to shake off the feeling that she was being watched, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" The only answer was the echo of her own voice, swallowed quickly by the suffocating silence. The hallway extended into a labyrinth of shadowed rooms and doorways, each one a gateway to forgotten stories. Lydia's flashlight flickered as she moved forward, the beam casting long, trembling shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. The thumping noise she had heard moments earlier had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to hold its breath. She passed under an archway into what appeared to be the manor's drawing room. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes that loomed in the dim light. An old piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed and chipped. On top of it lay an open music book. Its keys yellowed and chipped. On top of it lay an open music book, pages fluttering as though stirred by an invisible hand. Lydia's skin prickled, a chill coursing down her spine. The beam of her flashlight caught the glint of something metallic on the floor. Kneeling, she picked up a brass locket, tarnished and cold to the touch. She turned it over, finding the initials A. Pigduo engraved delicately on the back. A memory surfaced, something she had read in an old newspaper clipping about Grimsby Manor. Eleanor Blackwood, the last known inhabitant, had disappeared without a trace, leaving only whispers and mystery in her wake. A sudden noise snapped her back to the present. It was subtle at first, a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the walls. Lydia rose slowly, heart thudding in her chest. She followed the sound down a narrow hallway lined with portraits whose eyes gleamed in the dark. The tapping grew louder, morphing into a series of knocks that seemed to echo her footsteps. "Hello?" she called again, her voice breaking the silence this time. The response was immediate. A whisper, so soft it was almost swallowed by the air, drifted past her ear. "Leave before it finds you." Lydia spun around, the flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the hallway. There was no one there. The whispers faded, replaced by the slow creak of a floorboard shifting beneath unseen weight. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up as if someone were breathing down her neck. Lydia's gaze swept the room, taking in the layers of dust that had settled over furniture frozen in time. An ancient desk stood against the far wall, its surface littered with faded books and a yellowed letter, the ink barely legible. With trembling hands, she picked up the letter and read, "Dear Eleanor, the voices grow stronger by the day. Father refuses to leave his study, and Mother weeps through the night. Something lives behind the walls, watching us, waiting. If you find this, do not return. This place is no longer a home. It is a trap. Christopher." The words echoed in her mind, a testament to the terror that had once gripped the house. Suddenly, the air around her shifted, and a faint rustling sound filled the silence, as if someone or something was moving behind the heavy drapes. Lydia's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat as she backed away from the desk. The shadows at the edges of the room began to stir, subtle at first, but soon growing more pronounced. They seemed to coalesce, moving with intent. At that moment, Lydia realized these were not mere tricks of the light. The shadows were alive. They merged into a tall, gaunt figure, faceless yet unmistakably aware of her presence. "What do you seek here?" the shadow whispered, its voice thin and sharp, like the rustle of dry leaves in a winter wind. Lydia's voice faltered, the cold grip of fear tightening around her chest. The figure took a step forward, and the candle's flame sputtered before extinguishing, plunging the room into darkness. In that suffocating void, silence reigned, an unnatural, oppressive silence that felt almost sentient. Her fingers instinctively closed around the locket in her pocket, its cold metal grounding her pocket. In the present, the apparition vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the chill that seeped into her bones. The room was once again still, but Lydia knew this was only the beginning. Turning back to the desk, she searched through its drawers, uncovering an old key engraved with strange, intertwining symbols. It felt significant, as though it were a key to the manor's hidden heart, a place where secrets and shadows waited. Slipping it into her coat pocket, she took a deep breath, ready to venture further into the house depths. The key felt cold and heavy in Lydia's pocket, as she stepped out of the study and back into the hallway. The house seemed different now, as if it had sensed her discovery, and if it had sensed her discovery, and shifted in response. The walls, once silent, now hummed with an energy that set her nerves on edge. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rain that had begun to pound against the cracked windows, casting erratic shadows across the room. With each flash of lightning, determined to find what the key unlocked, Lydia moved toward the grand staircase that wound up into the darkened upper floors of the manor. Each step creaked beneath her weight, the sound echoing into the silence. At the top, she paused, straining to hear any sign of movement. A faint whisper seemed to drift from a hallway to her left, just at the edge of hearing. "Find us! Release us!" The voice was neither male nor female, but something ancient, layered with countless echoes. Lydia's breath caught as she turned her flashlight down the hallway. The beam illuminated portraits of the Blackwood family, their faces painted with stern expressions that seemed to come alive under the flickering light. One portrait in particular caught her attention, a young woman with a locket identical to the one in Lydia's pocket. Her eyes, rendered in deep blues, seemed to glisten with a hidden emotion, fear. A sudden noise behind her made Lydia spin around, heart thundering in her chest. The door to one of the rooms had creaked open, revealing only darkness within. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but the pull of the mystery was too strong. She stepped inside, the smell of damp and decay closing around her like a shroud. The room was a bedroom, once luxurious, but now reduced to a shell of its former grandeur. The canopy bed was draped with tattered fabric, and the dresser was cluttered with what trinkets that had long lost their luster. But it was the large, gilded mirror on the far wall that drew her attention. Its surface was cracked, the fractures forming a spiderweb pattern that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. As Lydia approached, the mirror fogged over, as if exhaling a breath. Her reflection disappeared, replaced by the image of a woman standing in the room with her, a woman with hollow eyes and a face twisted in anguish. The woman raised a hand, pressing it against the glass from the inside, her mouth moving in a silent plea. "Help us!" The whisper resonated in Lydia's mind, louder this time, filled with a desperation that chilled her to the bone. She stepped back, the key in her pocket growing unbearably cold. The room felt as if it were closing in on her, the walls shifting and creaking as if alive. Summoning her courage, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. The woman in the mirror nodded, a single tear tracing down her translucent cheek before the image faded, leaving Lydia alone with her racing heartbeat and the relentless patter of rain. The key was a promise, a directive. Find the truth and release the forgotten souls of Grimsby Manor. With the key now warm in her hand, Lydia felt a surge of resolve. The manor was no longer just a crumbling relic. It was a maze of secrets holding stories that had yearned for centuries to be uncovered. She glanced at the cracked mirror one last time before stepping back into the hallway. The soft murmurs of voices lost, pleading followed her as she moved. As she traced her steps along the corridor, Lydia noticed a peculiar pattern in the wallpaper, an intricate motif of vines that seemed to writhe, under her gaze. Running her fingers along the wall, she found a seam, almost imperceptible, that ran from floor to ceiling. Her pulse quickened. The key felt like it belonged here, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. She slid it, into the seam, and with a soft click, a hidden panel creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase spiraling down into the depths of the manor. The air grew colder as she descended, each step taking her further into the unknown. The walls here were rough stone, glistening with moisture, and the scent of damp earth mixed with something acrid, something that stung her eyes and burned at the back of her throat. A faint light pulsed at the end of the stairwell, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like specters. At the bottom, she emerged into a chamber unlike any she had seen. The room was vast, lined with stone pillars that reached up to a ceiling, lost in darkness. On the far side, an altar stood, carved her healing, lost in darkness. On the far side, an altar stood, carved with the same symbols as those etched on the key. Surrounding the altar were statues, each depicting figures frozen in expressions of terror and grief. Lydia's flashlight flickered as she moved closer, revealing more of the chamber. Ancient runes carved into the stone glowed faintly, casting an eerie blue light. She could hear whispers, distinct now, rising and falling like a tide. Find the truth. Free us from silence. The voice was louder now, resonant and sorrowful. Lydia's. Resonant and sorrowful Lydia's. Heart ached with the weight of their suffering. She reached out to touch the altar, and the room seemed to come alive. The statues' faces contorted, mouths opening in silent screams. The air crackled with energy, and shadow unfurled from the darkness, coalescing into a towering figure with eyes that burned like embers. "You dare disturb the silence?" the figure intoned, its voice deep and reverberating. The room shook with the force of its presence, and Lydia staggered back, fear rooting her to the spot. "I'm here to release you," Lydia said, voice trembling but resolute. She raised the locket and the key, their surfaces now glowing with a light that pulsed in rhythm with her racing heart. The figure hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it surveyed her. For a moment, the chamber was deathly still, the weight of centuries pressing down on both. Then, slowly, the figure's form began to waver, the burning eyes softening to an almost human sorrow. "Then speak the truth," it said, voice echoing into silence. Lydia took a deep breath, feeling the whispers around her merge into one harmonious plea. She knew now what she had to do. The chamber pulsed with an unnatural energy, the runes on the altar glowing brighter as Lydia stepped closer. The whispering voices around her merged into a single, rhythmic mic chant, their tone urgent and filled with both hope and dread. She held the key and the locket tightly, feeling their combined warmth seep into her skin. "Speak the truth," the shadowy figure urged, its form flickering between solidity and shadow, as if caught between realms. Lydia's mind raced, piecing together the fragments she had uncovered. The desperate letter from Christopher, the haunting portrait of Eleanor, the words in the journal. This was not just a place of haunted memories. It was a prison, bound by the grief and guilt of the Blackwood family. They had conducted a ritual to bind something unspeakable, but in doing so, they had trapped themselves and countless others in a cycle of silence and torment. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This house was a sanctuary, but it became a prison. You sought to bind the darkness, but it bound you in return. The silence that consumes this place is not peace, it's suffering." The glow from the runes intensified, the blue light shifting to a deep, resonant gold. The statues around the room began to crumble, their expressions of terror softening as cracks spider-webbed across their stone faces. The shadow figure wavered, its eyes losing their fire, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. Lydia lifted the locket and placed it on the altar, fitting it into an engraved depression that matched its shape perfectly, the air vibrated with a deep hum as the key in her hand grew searing hot, compelling her to insert it into the center of the altar with a resolute push. She turned the key, a brilliant light flooded the chamber, blinding in its intensity. The whispers turned into a chorus, triumphant and clear, no longer pleading but relieved. The shadow figure let out a final, breathless sigh and dissolved into the light, its forms scattering into fragments that shimmered like fireflies before vanishing. The room quaked as the energy released surged through the walls, shaking dust from the ceiling and causing cracks to splinter outward. Lydia felt herself pulled back, as though the very air was pushing her away. She stumbled, catching herself on one of the stone pillars as the light engulfed the entire chamber. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light dimmed, leaving a warm, golden glow that bathed the room in peace. The statues were gone, replaced by gentle, undisturbed stone. The oppressive weight that had haunted the manor lifted, replaced by a serene, almost sacred silence. Lydia stood in the now quiet chamber, her breath steadying as the warmth of the released energy wrapped around her like an embrace. The key and the locket were around her like an embrace, gone, melted into the altar itself, leaving behind only the symbols that no longer glowed but lay dormant, their purpose fulfilled. She climbed the spiral staircase back to the main floor, each step lighter than the last. The manor seemed transformed. The air was no longer heavy, and the dark corners were just that, corners, no longer hiding unseen eyes. Morning light filtered through the cracked windows, casting a soft glow that illuminated the dust motes dancing lazily in the ditch of the trees, and there needed the two-edged gallery. It kind of probably your winter's air. As she reached the main hall, Lydia looked back one last time. The portraits on the walls, once stern and watchful, now seemed different. The eyes were not accusatory, they were grateful. The faintest smile touched the lips of Eleanor's. They were grateful, painted figure. Her locket now resting within the painting itself, as a final nod to what had been set right. Stepping outside, Lydia felt the cool morning air fill her lungs. The storm had passed, leaving the ground wet and glistening under the steady, rising sun. The silence that had once been suffocating was now peaceful, like the deep breath of a soul finally at rest. The villagers of Hensbrook would notice the change. She was sure of it. The shadows that had loomed over Grimsby Manor for generations had been lifted. It was no longer a place of dread, but a monument to redemption, a testament to the power of facing the darkness and freeing the voices long forgotten. As Lydia walked down the path, leaving the manor behind, a gentle breeze rustled the ivy and carried with it a final whispered message, soft and content. Thank you. Mira Thompson had always been fascinated by the forgotten corners of history. As an archivist, she prided herself on uncovering the stories hidden in dusty tomes and ancient scrolls. So when she received a cryptic letter inviting her to the Charles, a scarlet, long-abandoned Ashwick library, she couldn't resist. The letter was written in an elegant hand and sealed with red wax that bore an unfamiliar sigil. The knowledge you seek lies in the halls of Ashwick, but beware the silence guards its secret secrets. Well, Ashwick Library was the stuff of local legend, an architectural marvel that had once been the pinnacle of scholarly pursuit before a fire nearly consumed it. The blaze had left much of the building intact, but had claimed the lives of several librarians and scholars. It was said that their voices still echoed in the halls, caught between the pages they had once cherished. Mira arrived at the library at dusk, its towering silhouette looming against the backdrop of a violet sky. The stone walls were scorched black in places, ivy and moss creeping up as if nature were trying to reclaim it. The iron gates were ajar, groaning as she pushed them wider. The air was heavy, scented with rain-soaked earth and the faint mud-soaked earth and the faint mustiness of old paper. The front doors of the library stood tall and foreboding, their wooden panels carved with seams of scholars poring over text. As Mira stepped inside, the scent of charred wood and mildew filled her nostrils. She clicked at charred wood and mildew filled her nostrils. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam piercing the darkness to reveal rows upon rows of towering bookshelves. The silence was so profound that it felt like a living thing, pressing against her ears. Her eyes caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the gallery. Light! She turned, the flashlight casting long, thin shadows that stretched across the floor. But there was nothing, only the worn wooden tables and the skeletal remains of chairs long abandoned. Then, from deep within the stacks, came a faint whisper. "Leave while you can." Mira's breath caught in her throat. The voice was low, almost mournful, and it sent a shiver down her spine, but she was not one to be deterred by old ghost stories. She took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and the whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Mira navigated the aisles of the library, her flashlight tracing the spines of books that had not been touched in decades. Dust motes danced in the beam, and the air grew colder with each step. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the silence became, as though the very walls were holding their breath. A sudden rustling sound made her spin around. A book had fallen from one of the shelves and lay open on the floor, its pages splayed as if reaching for something unseen. Mira bent down, the words on the page catching her eye. "The silence holds the answers, but it also holds the damned." Before she could process what it meant, a shadow moved at the end of the aisle. It was not the fleeting play of light she had seen earlier. This was deliberate, human-shaped. The shadow seemed to shift and slide between the shelves, its outline indistinct, yet undeniably present. "Is someone there?" Mira called out, her voice swallowed by the cavernous silence. The shadow paused, then moved closer. She felt a chill pass through her, like the breath of winter against her skin. The shadow stopped just beyond the reach of her light, and she The shadow stopped just beyond the reach of her light, and she could make out the faint, translucent outline of a figure in scholarly robes. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. It raised a hand and pointed to a book on a nearby shelf before vanishing into the darkness. Mira's heart thudded in her chest as she approached the indicated book. The leather cover was cracked and aged, and when she opened it, she found the words written in hurried, scrawled handwriting. "We tried to contain it. We failed. The silence is no longer ours to command." A sudden wind swept through the aisle, blowing her hair back and scattering loose papers. The whispering voices returned, now a chorus of warnings and pleas. Mira felt the urge to run, but forced herself to stay. There was more to uncover, and she was too close to turn back. The whispers subsided, leaving a heavy stillness that pressed against Mira like a physical force. She clutched the book in her hands, the leather warm to the touch, as if imbued with a life of its own. The library felt different now, more alive, as though it had awakened to her presence. She scanned the rows of towering shelves, each aisle a dark tunnel that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere, all at once. As she stepped deeper into the library, the air grew colder, biting at her skin. Her flashlight's beam flickered, casting erratic shadows that moved in unnatural ways. The floor creaked underfoot, the sound sharp and intrusive in the suffocating silence. Mira's pulse quickened, the rhythmic thudding in her chest the only sound that assured her she was still alive. She reached a rotunda in the center of the library, a vast open space surrounded by bookshelves that climbed up the walls like sentinels. Its heart was a circular table with an intricate design etched into its surface symbols and lines that seemed to shimmer when she moved the flashlight over them. The ceiling above was domed, cracked in places to reveal glimpses of the stormy sky. Outside, lightning illuminated the space briefly, casting the etchings in an eerie, silvery glow. Mira traced the symbols with her fingertips, feeling a subtle warmth emanate from them. Suddenly, a deep voice resonated through the room, low, low, and echoing, as if coming from the stone itself. Knowledge was our salvation and our curse, it intoned. The voice was not human. It was ancient, layered with a chorus of others. We sought to capture the silence, but it captured us others instead. The air thickened, and Mira's breathing quickened. She spun around, expecting to see the shadowy figure again, but instead, she was met with the sight of ghostly outlines emerging from the walls. Scholars, their faces etched with fear and determination, appeared one by one, their forms translucent and flickering like candle flames. One of the figures, a woman in a long robe with eyes that glistened with an unnatural light, stepped forward. "You must finish what we could not," she whispered, her voice mingling with the crackling energy that filled the room. Mira's mind raced. "Finish what?" she demanded, the book in her hands growing warmer by the second. The woman's form wavered, and her gaze shifted to the circular table. "The silence must be broken," she said, "or it will claim you, as it did us." Mira's hand trembled as she laid the book on the table. The symbols carved into the wood glowed brighter, casting the room in an otherworldly light. The ghostly scholars watched with solemn expressions, their outlines fading in and out of view as if caught between this world and the next. As the light intensified, a sound filled the air, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. The whispers returned, louder this time, not pleading, but demanding. "Release us!" A sudden pain shot through Mira's temples, and she gasped, clutching her head. Images flooded her mind, flames licking at shelves, scholars chanting in desperation, and a darkness that slithered between them like a living thing. The silence, she realized, was not just an absence of sound. It was a force, an entity that fed on knowledge and the souls that pursued it. Mira's vision cleared, and she found herself staring into the eyes of the spectral woman. The library around her seemed to pulse, as if it were a living organism with a heartbeat of its own. "The silence will take you if you hesitate," the woman said, her voice urgent and filled with an echo of pain. "To release us, you must speak the words inscribed. The book." Mira's hands shook as she opened the ancient book to the center page. The text was written in a language she had never seen before, but as she traced the characters, their meaning became clear. As if the book itself were guiding her, she began to read, her voice low and trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. The chamber around her shifted, the shelves groaning as if in protest. The ghostly figures closed their eyes, their faces softening from expressions of torment to those of hope. The humming intensified, filling the air with a vibration that made the floorboards quake. With each line, Mira felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. The silence fought back, a cold, suffocating force that tried to choke the words from her lips. She pushed through, the final line escaping her in a shout that reverberated through the library. "Break free and return to the light." The room erupted in a burst of energy, the ghostly figures dissolving into motes of light that rose to the ceiling and vanished. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a warmth that spread through the room like a sunrise breaking the longest dress night. Mira fell to her knees, the exhaustion of the ordeal pulling at her limbs. The silence was gone, replaced by the distant sound of raindrops on the cracked windows and the soft creaking of the library settling into peace. Mira sat on the cold floor of the rotunda, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the warmth settled over the room. The oppressive silence had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. The ghostly scholars had vanished, leaving only the flickering candlelight from the scarce destroying lections a minute dome above. For the first time since stepping into Ashwick Library, Mira felt a sliver of hope. But the respite was short-lived. From the depths of the library, a new sound emerged, a low guttural growl that reverberated through the walls and stirred the dust at her feet. Mira's pulse quickened as she realized that whatever force had been bound by the silence was still present, and it was waking up. A shadow moved across the far wall, large and sinuous, like a serpent sliding through water. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the symbols on the table dimmed, as if being swallowed by an unseen force. Mira scrambled to her feet, the ancient book clutched tightly in her hands. "You dare disturb the balance?" A voice, deep and guttural, filled the room. It was not like the whispers she had heard before. This voice carried with it the weight of ages. Raw and unforgiving, a figure began to materialize from the shadow, taking on a form that was both human and monstrous. Its eyes glowed a fierce, unnatural white, and its limbs were elongated, fingers curling like the claws of a bird of prey. The entity stood at the edge of the rotunda, watching Mira with a cold, calculating gaze. Mira, with a cold, calculating gaze, took a shaky step back. "I did what I had to. The souls trapped here deserve to be freed." The entity tilted its head, an unsettling grin spreading across its face. "And what of the price, mortal?" "Knowledge is never given freely." Mira's mind raced. The entity's presence exuded power, a force that resonated deep within her bones. She realized that it was more than just a guardian. It was the embodiment of the silence itself, the keeper of secrets that refused to be forgotten. She glanced at the book, its pages now blank as though it had given all it could. The scholars' voices, their warnings, echoed in her mind. To break the silence was to release its grip, but there was always a cost. The realization hit her like a blow. The entity was bound to the silence, and now that it had been disrupted, it sought to reclaim its hold. "There must be another way," she whispered, more to herself than to the creature. The entity stepped forward, its movement fluid and silent. "There is always a way, but are you prepared to pay it?" Before she could respond, the floor beneath her cracked, a deep fissure snaking its way toward her feet. The ground trembled as a cold wind swept through the library, extinguishing the flickering lights and plunging the room into near darkness. Mira's heart raced as the entity closed the distance between them. It extended a clawed hand, and with a voice like thunder, it spoke. "Sacrifice the key, or remain here as part of the silence forever." She glanced at the key embedded in there, as part of the silence forever. Altar, its glow fading. The choice before her was stark. Remove the key and risk losing herself to the silence, or leave it and let the library's curse continue. The room quaked as Mira steadied herself. The entity's eyes locked on her with a predatory focus. The whispers, once a cacophony, now murmured in a harmonious plea, urging her toward the altar. She reached out, the heat of the key pulsating against her fingertips as she wrapped her hand around it. Time seemed to slow as around it. She pulled the key free. The room erupted with a blinding light. the sound of splintering stone and cracking wood filling the air. The entity let out a guttural roar, its form dissolving into shadow and light, spiraling upward and dissipating into shadow and light, spiraling upward and dissipating into the darkness above. Mira fell backward, shielding her eyes as the energy surged around her. The warmth of the light seeped into every corner of the library, casting out the cold and filling the room with an almost tangible peace. The fissures in the floor sealed themselves, and the air, once heavy with dread, became lighter, breathable. The ghostly scholars reappeared, their forms now serene and translucent, no longer bound by fear or anguish. The woman who had guided Mira stepped forward, her expression soft and grateful. "You have done what we could not," she said, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of freedom. "The silence has been broken, and the curse is lifted." Mira's chest swelled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She watched as the spectral figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into motes of light that floated upward and disappeared through the cracks in the ceiling, carried away on an unseen wind. As the last of the scholars vanished, the library seemed to sigh, settling into a state of stillness that felt peaceful rather than suffocating. Mira stood, her legs shaky but steady. The book in her hands was now blank, its purpose fulfilled, and the key once was now blank, its purpose fulfilled, and the key, once a symbol of imprisonment, lay cool and inert on the altar. She made her way back to the entrance, the storm outside having calmed to a gentle patter of rain. Stepping out into the dawn's light, Mira took a deep breath, the fresh air filling her sighs, filling her lungs and clearing the last remnants of fear. The knowledge she had gained came at a price, but the silence of Ashwick Library was no longer a prison. It was a place of peace, where the voices of the past were finally at rest. Mira stood at these. Mira stood at the past were finally at rest. Entrance of Ashwick Library, the early morning light casting long golden rays across the grounds. The once oppressive silence that had enveloped the estate was replaced by the gentle hum of life returning. Birds chirped softly from the treetops, and the scent of rain-soaked earth mingled with the crisp, fresh air. She glanced back at the library, now more than just an architectural relic. It was a monument to the souls who had once been trapped within. Their whispers no longer would those be ingratitudes and a why. Voice could no meaning to the souls who had longer haunting the halls but carried away by the light that had broken the curse. The towering shelves, the cracked rotunda, and the etched symbols on the altar had all returned to their still, silent state, this time at peace. The key had once glowed with an eerie light, now lay dormant in her pocket, its edges cool and smooth. Mira ran her thumb over the intricate carvings, a reminder of the price that knowledge often demanded. The blank book, still clutched tightly in her other hand, seemed lighter than before, as if relieved of its burden. Stepping down the stone path, Mira felt a profound sense of closure wash over her. The journey to Ashwick had not just been an exploration of forgotten history, but a confrontation with the limits of human ambition and the echoes it left behind. The villagers of Hensbrook would awaken soon, and with the rising sun, they would feel the subtle shift in the air, a weight lifted, an ancient sorrow laid to rest. A sorrow laid to rest. She reached the iron gates. A gentle breeze stirred, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a final whisper. "Thank you, keeper of stories." A smile tugged at Mira's lips, bittersweet and knowing. She took one last look at Ashwick Library, its silhouette softened by the dawn, before turning and walking down the path that led her back to the world of the living. The silence that once spoke of dread now resonated with peace. A reminder that even in the darkest corners, light could face holes or resonated with peace. A reminder that even in the darkest corners, light could break through, and the voices that once cried out in anguish could find their rest. The road ahead was long, and the stories she carried would linger in her mind, but the silence of Ashwick would remain a testament to the power of stories untold, and finally, stories set free. The invitation arrived on a rainy afternoon, sealed with a wax emblem that sent a shiver down Eleanor Price's spine. As a historian specializing in the paranormal, she had explored abandoned manors, forgotten churches, and once even a sunken ship, but nothing had ever intrigued her like the tales of Eldermire Asylum. It was said that the patient's spirit still roamed its halls, bound by a collective agony that had never been resolved. The letter was succinct. Your presence is requested at Eldermire Asylum. The truth awaits, but only the brave may uncover it. The asylum sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, its silhouette stark and imposing against the gray sky. Ivy snaked up the cracked stone walls, and the once grand windows were shattered or boarded up, casting the inside in perpetual gloom. Thunder rumbled as Eleanor stepped out of her car, the chill of the rain soaking through her coat. She approached the iron gates, now rusted and hanging gates, now rusted and hanging, ajar, creaking with the wind. The entrance was foreboding, adorned with an arch that read, Sanctuary of Healing, its words now more ironic than ever. Pushing open the gate, Eleanor stepped inside, feeling as if she were crossing an unseen threshold. The foyer of Eldermire Asylum was vast, its marble floor cracked and littered with debris. A broken chandelier hung precariously, its crystals covered in years of grime. Eleanor's flashlight illuminated the peeling paint on the walls and the shattered remnants of medical equipment scattered above. Each step she took echoed into the silence, amplifying the void. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, catching the faded murals on the walls, depictions of serene landscapes meant to calm the patients. They felt grotesquely out of place in the decrepit setting. A noise interrupted her thoughts, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deeper within the asylum. It was a sound too deliberate to be the wind. She followed the corridor, her heartbeat sensing with the tapping. The hallway was lined with patient rooms, their doors either wide open or hanging from broken hinges. She peeked inside one, the smell of mildew and decay making her wrinkle her nose. Rusted bed frame sat in the middle, its sheets shredded and darkened with stains. She didn't want to identify. The tapping grew louder, coming from a room at the end of the hall. The door was marked with the number 217. Its paint chipped and faded. Eleanor reached out, the wood cold beneath her fingertips. As she pushed it open, the door groaned, revealing a small room with an old chair facing a shattered window. On the floor, scrawled in chalk, were words that made her blood run cold. We are not alone. Suddenly, the air shifted, heavy and suffocating. The tapping stopped, replaced by the soft, unmistakable sound of whispering. Eleanor spun around, her flashlight catching the outline of a figure standing in shadows. Its form was slight, almost skeletal, with eyes that gleamed like wet stones. Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the whispering grew louder, a symphony of voices overlapping until one voice emerged, clear and sorrowful. They won't let us leave. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Eleanor staring at the empty hallway. The whispering voices receded, melting into the silence that followed. Her hands shook as she pulled out her notepad and scribbled down what she had seen and heard. The words on the floor, the tapping, the ghostly figure, all signs that Eldermeyer's stories were more than just local legend. Determined to uncover more, she moved deeper into the asylum, past the hallway, and into what must have once been the common area. Broken chairs and splintered tables were scattered about, and old newspapers lay crumpled on the floor, their headlines speaking of the asylum's downfall. Mysterious illness claims the lives of 20 patients. Eleanor bent down to pick one up when a sudden chill swept over her, making her hair stand on end. A new sound filled the room, soft and almost melodic. The faint strains of a music box. It was the kind of sound that would have been comforting in another setting, but here it was sinister, dripping with an unspoken warning. She turned to see an old music box sitting on a nearby table, its gears turning on their own. The lid was open, revealing a tiny ballerina spinning slowly. Eleanor swallowed, fighting the instinct to run. Eleanor swallowed, fighting the instinct to run, reached out to close the lid, and as she did, the music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against her ears. A voice whispered directly behind her, close enough that she felt the chill of breath on her neck. "Don't wait, then." She spun around, but the room was empty. The music box fell from the table, landing with a metallic thud that echoed through the asylum. The silence that followed felt different, more charged, as if something had been disturbed. Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, searching for movement. For the first time, she realized that the air itself felt heavy, like it was watching her, waiting for her next move. Eleanor's heartbeat drummed in her ears as she cautiously stepped away from the fallen music box. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on her like a tangible weight. Every shadow seemed to shift as she moved, her flashlight casting trembling beams that illuminated fragments of the room in ghostly flashes. The common area felt alive, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor forced herself to focus. She needed answers, not panic. Her eyes swept the room, landing on a doorway, partially concealed by a fallen curtain. The worn sign above it read, Ward CC. Its letters faded and cracked. Ward C, she recalled from her research, was reserved for the most severe cases, the patients who had been too far gone for any semblance of normal treatment. The rumors said that none who entered Ward C ever truly left. She pushed through the heavy curtain, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The corridor beyond was narrower, the air colder and tinged with an acrid, metallic scent. Rusted gurneys lined the hallway, their wheels frozen in place with years of grime. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and beneath the layers, faint marks were visible scratches that formed words and symbols, Eleanor's and symbols. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them, as desperate messages scrawled by hands long gone. Help us, no escape, and silence feeds. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a dragging, shuffling sound, like feet scraping against the floor. It came from deep within the ward, a rhythmic, deliberate pace that made her skin crawl. She took a tentative step forward, her flashlight shaking as she lifted it to illuminate the path ahead. Stay. The word drifted out of the dark. Ahead. Stay. The word drifted out of the dark, drawn out and hoarse. It was followed by a slow, wet exhale that seemed to suck the warmth from the air around her. Eleanor froze, eyes darting into the shadows, searching for the source. The shuffling stopped, and for a moment the only sound was the ragged draw of her own breath. Then, just at the edge of her light, a figure emerged. It was a man, or what had once been a man tall, with a gaunt frame and eyes sunk deep into hollow sockets. His hospital gown, yellowed with age, clung to his skeletal frame, and his arms dangled limply at his sides. The man's head tilted, eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. He took a step forward, the dragging sound resuming as he moved. "They don't want you here," he said, each word punctuated with a rasp that grated against her nerves. Eleanor's legs felt like lead, refusing to obey her urge to run. She forced herself to speak, her voice barely a sanctuary, whisper. "Who are you? What happened here?" The man's mouth opened, but no words came out, only a deep, guttural groan that filled the corridor. He lifted a hand and pointed behind her, toward the far end of the hallway where a door stood slightly ajar, bathed in a soft, unnatural glow. The marks on the walls seemed to writhe, moving in response to the light. Turning to follow his gesture, Eleanor felt a rush of air pass her, cold and sharp, as if someone had brushed by at an impossible speed. The man was gone, leaving only the echoes of his warning behind. With each step toward the glowing door, the temperature dropped further, and a fine mist began to gather along the floor, curling around her ankles like fingers. The light spilling from the room was not warm, but pale and sickly, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted as she approached. Eleanor pushed the door open, revealing a room that was both pristine and wrong. Unlike the rest of the asylum, which had decayed with time, this room looked decayed with time. This room looked untouched. White sheets covered the furniture, and a small table stood in the center, holding a gramophone that spun silently, its needle hovering just above a record. The walls were lined with shelves that held jars filled with dark, viscous liquid, each containing small slips of paper that appeared to have writing on them. Her eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, the cold seeping deeper into her bones. The silence was absolute, broken only when she brushed against the gramophone and the needle dropped. A voice filled the room, cold and mechanical, yet eerily familiar. "In silence we find refuge, but in the silence we are bound to break the curse. One must listen beyond the whispers." The record stopped, and the light in the room flickered. The slips of paper in the jars began to move, pressing against the glass as if reaching for release. One jar fell, shattering at her feet and sending the dark liquid pooling around her boots. The slip of paper unfurled, revealing words scrawled in a hurried hand. "Listen, and we shall speak." The room quivered, and Eleanor heard the whispers return, not just as a distant noise, but as clear, distinct voices. They spoke of the past, of experiments, of torment and betrayal that echoed within the walls of the asylum, and one voice, louder than the rest, spoke directly to her. "Find the truth or share our fate." The words resonated deep within her, and she understood what she had to do. Asylum was not just haunted. It was a prison for souls trapped by silence and the horrors that had transpired. The only way to set them free was to confront the heart of the curse, the very reason Eldermeyer had fallen. She turned toward the shelves, eyes settling on the largest jar at the center, its liquid glowing faintly. Inside was a final slip of paper, folded tight. She reached out, fingers brushing the cold glass, ready to release what had been hidden for too long. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the cold, glass surface of the jar. The liquid inside shimmered with a subtle luminescence, and the slip of paper seemed almost alive. Trembling at her touch, taking a deep breath, she lifted the jar from the shelf. The whispers around her grew louder, overlapping until they became a near-deafening chorus. The room pulsed with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She carefully removed the lid, and the liquid inside released a chilling vapor that filled the room with a metallic tang. The slip of paper unfolded itself, revealing words scrawled in a jagged, desperate script. "The silence is broken when truth is spoken." A sudden wind surged through the room, extinguishing the pale light and leaving only the faint glow of the jars to illuminate the space. Eleanor's heart pounded as the air thickened, pressing down on her chest. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers now morphing into anguished feeble cries. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, the figures of patients and staff, translucent and drenched in shadow, appeared one by one around the room. Their faces were twisted with pain, their mouths moving soundlessly as they reached for her. The voice from the gramophone echoed again, louder this time. In the heart of silence, only the brave can release us. The realization dawned on Eleanor. This room was not just a place for recording the past. It was the heart of the asylum, where the essence of the silence was strongest. Whatever force had bound these souls here, it had left a piece of itself in this very room. She stepped toward the center of the room, where the gramophone sat motionless, as if no, how D, and there is Kiri. It's a use functionally in Vivan, round there, got any gramophone. I know, I chew. Sensing her resolve, the shadowy figures withdrew, their eyes watching her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Eleanor placed the slip of paper on the turntable, and the whispers hushed, replaced by an expectant silence, with whispers hushed, replaced by an expectant silence. With trembling hands, she set the needle back on the record. The gramophone crackled to life, and a voice familiar, commanding, yet broken by sorrow, filled the room. To break the silence, one must speak the name of the one who bound us. Eleanor's mind raced. The records she'd read, the stories whispered in the town, there was one name that had been mentioned only in hushed tones. Dr. Alistair Carrington, the asylum's last director. He had disappeared the night the asylum fell into chaos, and his name had become synonymous with the darkness that haunted Eldemire. Dr. Carrington, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The reaction was immediate. The walls shuddered, and the jars shattered one by one. Their jars shattered one by one, contents spilling onto the floor and evaporating into tendrils of mist. The figures around her raised their faces, expressions of torment softening into relief. The cries ceased, replaced by a gentle hum that resonated through the room. A final hum that resonated through the room. A final shadow emerged from the far corner. A man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glistened like black glass. He stepped forward, his face expressionless as he regarded her. "You have spoken the name," he said, voice deep and echoing. "Feel," said, voice deep and echoing. Silence no longer binds us. The man's form began to waver, breaking apart into fragments of light that drifted upward, joining the other souls as they ascended through the cracked ceiling and into the morning sky. Eleanor felt a rush of warmth wash over her, lifting the weight that had suffocated her since she'd entered the asylum. The room brightened, sunlight breaking through the storm clouds outside and filtering through the shattered windows. The cold mist dissipated, leaving the room filled with the soft glow of dawn. As the last fragments of light faded into the ceiling, the room settled into an eerie calm. The heavy silence that had once threatened to crush Eleanor was now replaced by a profound stillness, peaceful and tranquil, and sticky. This is peaceful and almost sacred. The gramophone, now quiet, sat motionless on the table. Its purpose fulfilled, the shattered remains of the jars were scattered around her, the dark liquid evaporating into thin air. Eleanor took a deep breath. The first that felt truly free since she'd stepped into Eldemire Asylum. The pale glow of morning seeped through the cracked walls, casting golden light across the room. The shadows that had once danced menacingly now lay still, lifeless. She glanced around, expecting to see one last figure, a remnant of the past that might refuse to let go, but there was only the soft murmur of the wind. The asylum had become just an empty, decrepit building once more, its power broken and its ghosts released. As she made her way back down the corridor, past the remnants of Ward C, she noticed how different the air felt. It was lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled. The scratches on the walls no longer shifted or moved. They were simply marks left by those who had once struggled within these confines, now part of history rather than horror. Eleanor stepped through the entrance hall. Past the fallen chandelier and broken furniture, the iron gates creaked open without resistance, as if welcoming her departure. She turned back one last time, looking at Eldermeyer Asylum, now bathed in the soft glow of dawn. It was no longer a place of torment, but a monument to resilience, to the souls that had been bound and were now free. The whisper of a breeze brushed past her, carrying with it a faint echo. "Thank you." A smile touched her lips as she walked away, the rising sun casting a shadow long and far. She knew that Eldermeyer would remain a story to tell, a place marked by tragedy but now at peace, and she, Eleanor Price, would carry its story with her, a testament to the power of courage, truth, and the breaking of silence. The road ahead was clear, the weight on her heart lifted. She took one last deep breath and stepped into the light, leaving the echoes of Eldermeyer behind.